Welcome to the presentation. The title of this presentation is Baltic Lean Launchpad, Student-Centered Entrepreneurship Curriculum in Lithuania. I'm Dr. Doug Gilbert. I teach at Walden University and the University of Phoenix. This presentation will concern a teaching assignment I had in the fall of 2019 at Vilnius University in Vilnius, Lithuania. The teaching assignment came as a part of the Fulbright Specialist Program, which is administered by the U.S. Department of State. The agenda of what we'll talk about today in this presentation: first, I will set some context. Second, a bit about the Lean Launchpad, where it comes from, how it's taught, and a little bit of its history and lore. Third, how that was adapted for Lithuania for a setting in a different culture, country, and entire ecosystem. Fourth, the lessons that we learned the first time around with the Lean Launchpad. And last, what do we plan to do next? To the right on this slide, you can see the three Baltic countries. At the top is Estonia. And Estonia is shown in the blue, black, and white. It is the smallest of the three Baltics. It is bordered by Russia on the east and the Baltic Sea mostly on the west. In the middle is Latvia. Latvia is kind of in the middle in terms of population and a number of things in the Baltics. And at the bottom is Lithuania. Lithuania is bordered on the east by Belarus and the west by Poland. Latvia is bordered by Russia and Belarus on the east and on the west mostly by Poland. You can see the star in the green part of Lithuania. That is where Vilnius is, pretty close to the eastern border of the country. Bit of context on Vilnius University. The university is a historic university. It was established in 1579. Current enrollment is around 21,000 students. The current number of faculty is about 2,900. The business school was established very close to the time that Lithuania transitioned from a Soviet Socialist Republic to an independent republic in 1989, very early on. It was established as an independent private business school, subsequently integrated into Vilnius University. In 2018, the university and the business school took the novel step of creating an entrepreneurship curriculum with an MBA focused solely on entrepreneurship and several baccalaureate programs that wove in different aspects of entrepreneurship. Most of the courses offered in the entrepreneurship curriculum are based on the Stanford model for how entrepreneurship is taught. A little context about Lithuania and entrepreneurship. Lithuania lags in entrepreneurial activity and skill sets, and I'll show that in a couple of graphs here. First graph is the Comparative Global Entrepreneurship Index elements. There are three of these elements that are done by a group that looks at all the countries in terms of entrepreneurship, publishes an annual index. One of those is in blue, is shown as the abilities. So these are kind of the skills, how good is an organization, or a country in delivering entrepreneurship. What are the attitudes towards entrepreneurship? Is it positively received, negatively received? And is entrepreneurship something that individuals aspire to be a part of? At the top you can see as a reference point the U.S., which is held out as the most entrepreneurial country in the world. In terms of abilities, it is close to a 90 on a scale of 100, so very high. In terms of attitudes, also very high, and in terms of aspirations. You can see then the three Baltic countries of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And you'll note that Lithuania lags in terms of its abilities when compared to the other two Baltics. I've also added Finland, which is a neighbor to Estonia to the north, across the Baltic Sea. And you can see that Finland is far ahead of any of the Baltics in all three categories, but especially that of abilities. Now each of those three areas of abilities, attitudes, and aspirations have subcomponents. When we look at the startup skills subcomponent of abilities, and we take those same 5 countries, the U.S. ranks at the top, and this is a scale from 0 to 1, with a scale of 1. Finland is very high on the skill set. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania are a bit lower, but notice that Lithuania lags the other 2 Baltics in this area as well. So hence there's a gap that Vilnius University is seeking to cover as one of the premier universities in the country by including entrepreneurship in a substantial part of its business curriculum. The business school offers an MBA in entrepreneurship, which is a very specific and interesting process that it is the only part of the business curriculum offered in the MBA. So a traditional MBA would offer many different things in management. Only entrepreneurship, however, is offered at Vilnius University. And you can see how this program is designed. It's designed in 2 semesters with different blocks that are called modules. It's a European approach to organizing content. The first semester, 4 courses, beginning with opportunity recognition, moving through to some financial management. Second semester is around commercialization, going through to rapid growth. And at the bottom is the project, which is done usually outside of Lithuania with the class. Where I taught in this was in the opportunity recognition and evaluation, so the very beginning of the MBA. Let's talk a little bit about Lean Launchpad, where it comes from, and what are its basic components. First of all, where it comes from, its origins. Origins are at Stanford, and probably the most advanced and clear formulation of the curriculum as Lean Launchpad came out of a I-Corps grant that was given to Stanford about a decade ago when this curriculum was created. There's also a substantial amount of lean and agile startup movement in the Bay Area, different groups and different ways that this is handled. What are the components that we used and are typically used in the Lean Launchpad? The business model canvas, which was developed by Alex Osterwalder and Yves Pignol in Switzerland, is a very fundamental part of this. In addition to that, the customer development approach, in other words, learning about your customers, created by Steve Blank, who taught in the original I-Corps at Stanford, is a key part of what we do particularly in this part of the MBA curriculum. And there's also the idea of the lean startup, so the idea of a minimum viable product as opposed to having everything right the first time around. Some of the curriculum elements that we used to deliver this were, first of all, a flipped classroom, extensive use of materials that students are expected to look at before they come to the classroom. That included hours of videos, usually chunked up into smaller portions for viewability. Experiential learning is a key part of the model that we used, and we had a specific approach to that based on Kolb's model, and a lot of team learning. I'll talk in detail about each of those 3 things as we move through the presentation. So how did we adapt the Lean Launchpad from Stanford, which offers the Lean Launchpad to highly skilled students in 2 areas, one in the School of Engineering, where they actually build products and take them to market, and also in the business school, where they're looking more at setting up a business. Well, there were several areas that we felt and looked like it was necessary to adapt as I worked with administration at Vilnius University. First was we knew the curriculum at Stanford would not be appropriate for the Vilnius University students. They come from usually English is not a native language environment, so some adaptations were needed there. Also, their environment in terms of entrepreneurship is not nearly what you would see at Stanford, so some changes were made there. The learning interactions needed to change because the European system with modules is very different than what we see at Stanford with a semester-based approach. Assessment involved a somewhat of a change, more of a change for the Vilnius University students than from the standard Lean Launchpad, but nonetheless the module system dictated some differences. And then the scholarship of teaching and learning, or SOTL, and how did we improve the class during the time that we were offering it, and how do we plan to improve it in the future. So let's move on to curriculum. First of all, the schedules are very intense in the curricular model used at Vilnius University. And I'm showing here both the undergraduate entrepreneurship class that I taught as well as the MBA course in evaluating opportunity and recognizing opportunity. If you look at looking first at the left at the undergraduate, you can see that we're offering 9 hours of instruction per week in groups of 3 hours with usually a break in the middle. Some differences there for changes because of scheduling, but essentially 9 hours per week. The MBA is even more intense. It's offered as an executive format, and it is 7 hours per day over a 4-day period. That was 2 different weekends with 2 weeks in between. There was some pre-work that we had and some work in between and some work after the class. So a little bit of a blended model. The underlying learning model that we used was Kolb's experiential learning, which is shown here. Kolb's has 4 parts. First, a concrete experience, doing something, reflecting on that experience through some observation, analyzing it, so verbalizing it typically, creating an abstraction in the sense of formulating the concepts and ideas, and then active experimentation. And that's run in a cycle, and we certainly did that, and I'll talk a little bit now about how we did that. In terms of the concrete experience, doing and observing, we needed to introduce this idea of business model canvas and customer discovery. How we did that was through classroom exercises, so introducing what is the business model, what are customers, how, in the sense of business model, what are their value propositions, who you serve them with, and then we would engage in customer interviews. And we practiced those interviews in pairs in the classroom and then in teams over a couple of different times, depending on whether it was undergraduate or graduate. To go to a reflective observation, we then had a process of students capturing the interviews, actually in a Google Sheet, a fairly simplistic approach, and then we would come back and ask them to report in a classroom dialogue about what they had learned in that interview. Again, creating this analytical experience, understanding what they've done. How did we get them to create an abstraction? Well, we brought them back to the business model canvas, and we also used components of a particular approach to design thinking, which is a European approach coming from Switzerland and an author named Michael Lurich. And last but not least, how did we get them to do active experimentation? We asked them to change their model and again do more customer interviews. So this is applying what they've learned from customers about the value of their ideas and changing their ideas and then going back through this whole process again. So Kolb's model fits very well with what we were trying to do with the Lean Launchpad approach. One of the aspects about curriculum that is a challenge with this type of teaching is that the faculty needs to be very agile and adopt a just-in-time approach. And by agile, we mean that don't look at class sessions as something where you're going to deliver content to students. Instead, the idea that we brought forth was something called labs. So we renamed the classes sessions as labs. That's modeled after a experiential learning program in Denmark called Chaos Pilots. Chaos Pilots has been operating for almost 40 years now, so it's a very, very well-refined approach and was a great place to look for this idea. We also used Google Docs very extensively, which allowed a very agile approach to anything we did in the classroom. It wasn't the standard set of PowerPoint slides that we would offer and not be able to go anywhere, that the Google Docs could be adapted very quickly. In terms of just-in-time, the curriculum was adjusted every day, sometimes even during the day with the 7-hour sessions based on some formative assessments that we put into the course. And the in-class teamwork would be adjusted on the fly. How I did this was I would observe the various teams as they worked during the team times, and if I wasn't seeing effective teamwork, things such as completing early, people watching cell phones, not engaging with one another, we would change the assignment and we would change the way that things worked. And that worked out very well because the students were usually very grateful that you help them achieve their tasks in a more designed and disciplined approach. So the main elements of the curriculum were two. It was a business model canvas and design thinking. And in terms of the business model canvas, we had a three component part of that. So we take the customer view on the right-hand side of the canvas and begin there. We work through the economics view for customers and then go to the operations and economic view. To link that to design thinking, we use something called a persona. So in design thinking, typically we work with identifying customers, understanding needs, observing them, hence the customer development interviews, defining a point of view, which we call an experiment or a hypothesis in business model canvas language, and then testing that. So you can see the ideation and prototyping and testing that happens in design thinking works very well. So the link was around personas. Students were asked to define their customer segments as a persona. And the persona takes quite a while to understand as a concept and a while to refine for the students. But generally they found it very, very helpful. Some examples of templates that we used. The customer value proposition map, which is a part of the business model canvas software called Strategizer, was one of those things. That helped us understand what a customer might want in terms of gains and pains and their customer jobs. And we also used empathy maps, and this helps us define the idea of the persona. Here's another example of a user profile or a persona idea, and something that you can note here near the number 1 is the persona has a lot of different potential variables. It's not just standard demographics, and we worked a lot with students about trying to get them to understand that it's not just age, income, social status, and some of the standard demographics, but it's actually buying behavior, preferences, and things like that, which define the persona in a much more usable way for a Lean Launchpad and a business model canvas. Jobs to be done is an important part of this canvas and an important part of all we do. That is based on Clayton Christensen's work at Harvard University a number of years ago. Gains and pains is a fairly standard way to look at how a product can be helpful or a service can be helpful to a potential customer. Again, many uses of templates to help animate and make this a more fun exercise for students and to get the ideas here. And you can see that there are different ways that students can animate this with Post-its, and again in Google Docs that's very easy to do, or simply draw it out if they want to and put it out on a large poster in the classroom. Talk a little bit about the learning interactions. So I talked about curriculum in the class model, the curriculum, learning interactions, assessment, and scholarship of teaching and learning. So here's learning interactions. How did those work? Well, as I mentioned, first of all, heavy reliance on flipped classroom. And it isn't just reading things before you come to the class, which I think is a very low level of flipped classroom, but instead there were a lot of videos. The videos were usually chunked into short delivery segments. The shortest would be about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The longest might be about 10 minutes. The 10-minute ones were unusual. This is an example of a Steve Blank video to talk about what is a business model. Very fundamental thing to what we were teaching in the class. And it helps the students do things kind of on the fly, chunk it, and come prepared. It also is a great bridge for English as not the mother tongue of most of these students. It's easier for them to understand the videos with these different types of graphics in them that draw things as they go, and with VideoScribe or some of the other tools, so that the students are able to see and hear at the same time. As I mentioned, we use Google Docs real-time in class. This is an example of one day where we had 6 different groups working on a business idea. So each student had their own business idea, and each student would then work on a business model canvas for that idea. What we would do in the classroom, as I mentioned, is use team-based learning. So the teams would assist one of the students for a while on their business model, then we would switch and rotate through the teams as the others. We would typically ask for a volunteer, and then we would pick one other one to do one or two more rounds of student assisting through the class. And you can see we have different things happening, but this is what it looked like on the projector on the wall. We could watch real time as students put post-it notes onto the business model canvas, and patterns start to emerge across different business model canvases and team efforts. For example, the color coding, the use of color coding for customer segments is something that is taught. The canvas on the left does that reasonably well with the yellow, red, and blue to demonstrate the customer segments, and then begins to work that through with the customer relationships and the channels as it's developing out the business model canvas. But if we look at the right-hand side, you'll see the color coding is all over the place. So this is a good lesson, visual, for students to show them how they should be adapting to customer segments and have that as a fundamental basis of what they do in the business model canvas. So Google Docs were a great tool, easily used by students and well supported by the university. Talk for a moment of assessment. So this is the third part of that CLASS acronym of Curriculum, Learning, Interactions, Assessment, and Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So what did we do for assessment? Well, it's a bit challenging because this is a different world. With the long classes of 3 to 7 hours, there was an extensive need for formative assessments. So you can see on this is a typical storyboard plan that I had for a 7-hour class on September 13th. This would be in the MBA. And in yellow, you can see where I was inserting different types of formative assessments. And you'll note that I have the tools in there. If I'm putting things on a flip chart, I'm doing a whiteboard capture, and typically with the beauty of cell phones and the ability to take a picture of something and post it up to the class site, this is something that can be captured for the student and distributed to them almost immediately after the class. The assignments were progressive, which was something foreign to the students in Vilnius, but something they did adapt to very well. So here's an example of how we progress through the business model canvas. As I mentioned earlier, there's a customer view, an operations view, and an economics view, which are kind of 3 sets of blocks in the 9 blocks of the business model canvas. We would start with the customer view and work through, first of all, customer segments and value propositions. We then would move to customer relationships and channels. After that, as a third part, we then say, all right, you have all these great customer ideas, you understand how you're going to serve them, what are they going to pay and how often are they going to pay, and how are you going to actually create revenue from these opportunities. We then moved over to how we deliver that value through the operations view, and then how we pay for that delivery. As these assignments built on one another, the students learned that a business is a series of building blocks, beginning with the customer and the value delivered to customers. So here are some examples of how that was put in place with the assignments. So every assignment, students were asked to post a slide deck that had certain components. And this is a slide deck. So first of all, the identification of who you are. And second of all, the team that you recognize. So remember, the students are consulting with one another on individual student plans. So first of all, the students were asked to begin with an idea of their current business idea. And this is their current business idea in about a 3rd or 4th iteration. So this is for a food delivery app that one of the students was trying to create for Vilnius. She felt that food delivery in Vilnius was far below what she was used to in China, and that there would be a lot of demand for good food delivery. So students are asked to refine this on a frequent basis. Students are also asked to fill out their business model canvas and update that on an assignment by assignment basis. Recalling that we had the different parts that were done in different stages, so the customer segments and value propositions first, customer relationships and channels and revenue streams kind of second and third, and then moving over to operations. We expected the business model canvas to be populated in that fashion. Even though this was only opportunity recognition as a class, we did the full business model canvas because there was a need in my mind, and I think it proved out in terms of the students, to have the holistic picture of everything that was happening in that business model. Because customer segments and value propositions may look interesting, but if it's impossible to get enough revenue, that's certainly not going to be an opportunity that can be acted upon. If customer relationships are too difficult or too expensive, or channels are just impossible to penetrate, again, might be something that doesn't need to happen. And then we come over to the operations side. Great ideas die because they can't be delivered. So this helps the students see the holistic picture of opportunity recognition, even though later in the MBA they will be looking at different aspects of that. Another example is the use of the customer value proposition map. So this is Caitlin, again, with the app for food delivery, trying to look at the jobs to be done and trying to understand how things can be pains and gains and how the product can fit that. Students were also asked to report on how they were working with their teams. Not all teamwork was in the classroom. Some of it was outside of the classroom. This was about a quarter of every grade in terms of the rubric used. So if they didn't demonstrate that they had effective teamwork, they lost quite a few points. They figured that out after the first 1 or 2 sessions when they lost a lot of points. So they have to demonstrate each week how they work with every other team member. This is again Caitlin working with 3 other team members in her grouping. Students were also required to submit a interview summary. This is a Google sheet that I asked them to submit as a PDF so that they can lock it in terms of terms. And you can see that they've talked about who they interviewed, what they learned, and what type of interview this was. Students could interview other students or could interview people around the university. We'd prefer if they interviewed actual customers, but we recognize this is a learning environment as opposed to the real thing, but certainly helpful to practice these skills with other students. Students also were asked to say what are they going to do next. This was the last slide in the mandatory deck. So first was about testing their hypotheses. They were asked to set up hypotheses and they would test them, and so you can see what hypotheses the student was planning to test here. Updating the minimum viable product, again that idea from lean startup of minimum viable products as opposed to the whole approach, and then personal other action items that the student would be moving toward around the business model canvas. Very often in each of the courses I would, or each of the classroom sessions or labs as we call them, I would do 1 to 2 tickets out the door, either before a break or at the end of the class, just to see where students were at. And these were really rapid, formative assessments I would use. And how this worked is I would take some type of graphic. This is a picture of a ticket from the Titanic, and we were a little bit past the sinking of the Titanic time, so we were talking about that. And it would be there with either a shortened URL with Rebrandly is what I used, or a QR code that allowed the students to fill this out on their mobile phone. But here's an example of that particular questionnaire. These were done in Google Forms, so they could be put together very rapidly. And the results looked at almost immediately when the students came back in. Student name, and then based on the work with cost structures, did you need to pivot your business model? And so 1 to 5, I could look at the graphics when we came back after the break. This happened very rapidly, and we would have a discussion. So not only formative assessment in the sense of doing things to try and understand, but also, again, that experiential learning process of around that formative assessment. A little bit about scholarship of teaching and learning. That's the last part of that class model that I talked about. In terms of evaluating the course, there were 3 reflective assignments where I asked the students to provide input and would give me kind of a temperature check of how the students were doing. The first assignment in the series was for the student to profile an entrepreneurial company. And this could be typically any company, but we had some barriers or some guardrails around what that had to be. It had to be startup. I think started within the last 3 years. It could not have gone public and could not be a large multinational. So for what would not be count for that is something like Uber or any of the hotel different types of companies, such as the Airbnbs or those types of things. These kind of unicorns that are already out there and past $1 billion in capitalization or sales. It needed to be something that was fairly new. I tried to encourage them to look at something in Lithuania. It has a fairly robust set of companies, and that would help them understand what they need to do in the local context. We also used a team charter, and the team charter helped to create understanding of how well the teaming was working. And then at the end of the course, they were required to do a summative reflection on what they've learned. This is an example of the team charter canvas. As I mentioned, most of these things we would do canvases with pictorial elements rather than a standard word-based assignment. Helps a lot with students that are, first of all, not English as the mother tongue, and second of all, trying to move rapidly. So both of those things are assisted by using tools like this. It also gives me a very rapid temperature check and a visual as to how well they're experiencing the process. Student reflections, here's just a couple. First of all, one out of the bachelor's degree. You can see that this student understood that this was a fascinating journey through the world of entrepreneurship. And they've had similar courses to this, but none were as well organized. So that's always a nice thought. Then also in the MBA, they recognized that an MBA in entrepreneurship was something different, and they're very excited about moving toward a whole business plan and deciding the way of building customer relationships. So overall, I felt the reflections indicated the students learned a lot and gained a substantial amount of value. Some of the interesting reflections likely to be seen from this are, I will never ever do this type of business. And those are some of the best things that I've ever seen in my teaching career. Students have invested whatever hours it is in a semester or module and decided that they're not going to invest their life savings in some type of venture that they now know will not work. So that's a great lesson learned, and typically they will go on to something far better and far more rewarding than their initial idea. Some of the key lessons that we learned out of this process. Well, first of all, this was a new paradigm for students in a number of ways. In Lithuania, the most common teaching method of Lithuanian instructors and others that come in from Europe are to use lectures. In our case, it was a very minimal use of lectures, and they welcomed that. They enjoyed that. They're tired of lectures. Many of the comments I had in the reflections were, "Thank goodness you didn't do lectures." One shocker to the students is we didn't have any exams. This upended their entire normal way of working, which is to not attend the lectures, come for the midterm and final, which is the two assessments that are typically given, and then they're done with the course. It took about a week with the undergraduates and fairly immediately one session with the graduates for them to understand that they weren't going to have the lecture test method. The peer interaction was somewhat problematic at the beginning. We tended to have some language-based clusters that we had to work on. Some of the Lithuanians all wanted to work together. The Russian speakers all wanted to work together. So there was a need to kind of mix up the teams, and we did that in a number of different ways over time to get people to cross-pollinate and work together with different people. The use of a progressive assignment was a very foreign concept. An assignment that built on a prior assignment's output and evaluation by the faculty member was not something that was readily understood by the students, and we had to work on that. Timing was also an issue. Students, if they turned in an assignment late, the feedback would not be there necessarily as quickly as it should have been for them to do the next assignment on that progressive approach. The technology, the use of collaborative technology was very well received by students. And they're very used to it in Lithuania. So I was quite surprised. I didn't anticipate that, but Lithuania is very much on the forefront of this. The flipped classroom was a little bit challenging. Students were not used to that approach. We're not used to a front-end loading approach of learning everything up front and then coming to classroom and practicing. They got better with it as we went through the term, but still many would not come well prepared. In terms of teaching, we learned that there's a need to integrate industry mentors, as in the original Lean Launchpad. We didn't have time to do that. And the student teaming process was challenging due to basically immigration and late student enrollments that kept happening. That was something beyond our control, but something certainly that we will take into account in future offerings of this course. So what's next? Well, the blended model is something that we are planning to do for 2020. So instead of me being on site for the entire course time, I will be teaching it remote through a series of probably Zoom lectures and flipped classroom exercises and discussions to allow us about a month to get students up to speed on a number of pieces of the business model approach. We want to have a much stronger integration with the startup ecosystem. I'm working with Startup Lithuania to pair students with startup companies more around a learning exchange rather than a consulting type exchange. And we're going to enhance design thinking even more through some practice visits. SE-Banken, which is a Swedish bank with a large presence in Vilnius, has offered to assist us with some real hands-on approaches virtually as well in terms of how they do design thinking for fintech, which is a major part of the entrepreneurial landscape in Lithuania as well as Estonia. So I'd like to thank you very much for taking time to look at this presentation. If you're viewing this remote, please feel free to submit your questions to me. If we are in the actual ACBSP conference and you're viewing this remote, we will have a time for you to live ask questions and answers. Thank you very much, and I hope that you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the Lean Launchpad in Lithuania, a very unique experience and one that we hope to repeat. Have a great day.